Hey guys, how are you doing? My name is Medic Hero. Today we'll be looking at how I used the whiteboard for each of the UCAT subsets, and I believe this is a great blessing to be able to draw on your whiteboard and do whatever you want on your whiteboard. Now, before I begin, I'd just like to say, when would you actually draw on your whiteboard or write stuff on your whiteboard? Well, you've got two options. One, is the 1 minute instructions reading time. Now, the other option is actually before the exam. So, before the exam. Now, I don't mean literally, well, I kind of do mean literally just before you start the exam, because before then you have a couple of instructions to read, and throughout that, I think you're timed as well. I believe so. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now, I don't mean literally before the exam. Okay, maybe I do, but throughout this period, you're reading a couple of instructions, what the UCAT is, and then I think there's a button that says start the exam as well. And then once you start, then there are other few instructions to read as well. So that period is very, very long. And well, I say very, very long, but you can obviously skip it as well. But during this period, you could possibly also write some stuff down on your whiteboard as well. But I also want you to double check that with, your center as well. So now let's break down each of the subsets. Looking at verbal reasoning, what did I do for verbal reasoning? Well, I wrote down the topics I disliked. And those topics were anything on fighter jets, and then any politics. But then there was a certain category of politics as well, which I can't exactly remember right now, but I believe there was. I would write down a couple of, topics I disliked, and there would be around, 5, maybe 4 different topics. I knew every single time I'd get a passage on this, I would immediately skip it, or I'd flag it, answer it, come back to it. And I believe there were around 3 topics I disliked the most, and every time I came across those topics, I'd immediately Control F, answer the questions randomly, and then move on. It's as simple as that. The reason for me telling you this is so that you can also write down topics you dislike. I have already released a video on triaging throughout verbal reasoning. Take a look at that because it's all about this. And I believe it's probably one of the most helpful things that I've ever used, throughout verbal reasoning subset. So, moving on, what else did I write on my whiteboard? Well, I wrote down this. So, I literally wrote 10 lives and then a box. And what does that mean? That means that I have 10 lives, which is equivalent to 10 questions. So if I wanted to, and if I was really, really desperate, I could easily miss out 10 questions without having to worry. But there's a compromise. If I miss 10 questions, then I need to get 101% every other question right. So basically, the more questions I miss out, the more confident I need to be with answering all the questions in verbal reasoning. The reason why I did this is, number one, it kind of relieved the anxiety, the stress whilst answering these questions, because I know the stress when it comes to a question which you are stuck on and you can't answer it, and then you're looking at the time and then you're like, I really need to speed up. What can I do? What can I do? And then at that moment, you just want to skip. So that's why I gave myself 10 lives. So I got all of this information from this chart right here. Now, this chart is an estimation of multiple different scores over the past few years, and it gives you an idea of how many scores or points or marks you might need in order to get a certain score. So, for example, 44 obviously would give you 900, but for example, a mark like 32 would give you 750. And bearing in mind that the whole verbal reasoning subset is out of 44. Now, I gave myself 10 lives, which would give me around 780, which is a relatively decent score. But even then, even if I missed out more than 10 lives, I still wouldn't care because, sorry, when I say 10 lives, I mean more than 10 questions. I wouldn't care because getting a lower score than 780 is still relatively good. In fact, 600 is a very good, decent score for verbal reasoning. So I wouldn't stress too much about verbal reasoning and trying to aim for 900 because, number one, statistically is the worst subset out of all of them. So I only found this table towards the end of my revision for the UCAT, and instead what I did was I only found this table towards the end of my revision. So towards the start, what I used to do was go into Medify. I would do around 44 questions, which is the maximum you can do in verbal reasoning. And let's say I got 28 right. From this, I would calculate the percentage, which I think it was 63%. So 28 out of 44 is 63%. So then what I would do is just get rid of the percentage sign and add a 0. And so it becomes 630. So I know if I got 28 right in the exam, then that would mean I would get somewhere around 630. And that's what I used to do. And I believe that's, somewhat accurate, I guess. Kind of. Obviously, your score is dependent on multiple different things, like how hard it is, the cohort that year, and so many other different factors that come into play, which affects the algorithm of trying to determine your score. Now, the reason for me telling you this is so that you can use the 10 lives or however many lives you want in the exam. So first of all, step number 1 is set yourself a goal. What score would you ideally want in the verbal reasoning exam? Be realistic with yourself. There's no point trying to stress yourself out and trying to aim for an 850 when you know that, it's kind of hard, the amount of time you have, and it's just going to add too much stress to you. Stress can take your score all the way down. Don't do that. And it doesn't matter if you get 500, 600 in verbal reasoning. It really doesn't. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Okay, so once you've identified your goal, let's say, for example, I decided to do 630 as my goal, which is a pretty decent score. So with that, I know that I would have to miss, 16 questions in order to get 630. But that's on the condition I get every other question right. And obviously, I've also got to account for silly mistakes as well. So that's when I would increase the lives by, another 5 or so. But then that means you would lower your score down by quite a lot, giving yourself that many lives. But then having your lives there does not necessarily mean you use all your lives up. That, like, when you play a game and you've got like 5 lives, the aim is to retain and keep all of those lives as much as you possibly can. Obviously, the whole point is not to use them all up. But if you are stressed and you're just feeling the pressure of the exam, use them. They're there to relieve the stress, and so you can focus on the questions you can actually get right. So in the exam, I know I have 16 lives. Let's assume that the additional 6 I've got here. So originally I had 10, but if I had an additional 6 on, it wouldn't hurt because that 6 would be accounting for any silly mistakes as well. So what I would do here is I would tally down any question I miss. So every time I miss a question, I'd put a 1 or just mark it down. And then I'd constantly do this throughout the whole exam. Obviously, you don't have to miss all 16 questions out, but this is just an example. And it just shows you how many lives you've used up or questions you've missed out. Obviously, there is the Control F button, but sometimes it will help you to know how many questions you've actually missed so far without having to go all the way to the end and risk clicking next and submit, and then you can't go back to verbal reasoning. So that's why I kind of keep this tally chart here, right here. Hopefully that makes sense and not overly confusing. If it is, comment down below. So step number 1, find your goals. Step number 2, calculate how many questions you would need to miss out. Step number 3, add an additional, let's say 5 or 6 marks to it. 6 questions. And that would account for, the silly mistakes as well. And then in the exam, you have this many lives. But the more lives you lose, the more focus and the more confident you need to be with getting the rest of the questions right. So this technique here definitely did help me and reassured me throughout the exam that if I got this amount of questions wrong, don't worry, you can still get a decent enough score. And it really did relieve me. And trust me, you'll find so many people out there with 2,900, and even though they had 540 in their verbal reasoning, or 500-ish, or somewhere around that. So honestly, getting a low score in verbal reasoning, first of all, do not worry, because like I said before, or I don't know if I did say it before, I've kind of forgotten, but it's statistically one of the worst subsets out there. So moving on. So the other thing that I would draw on my whiteboard for verbal reasoning is this little table right here. So really, I don't need to draw the whole entire table. I just need to draw the headings, and then obviously I draw the lines as I attempt each question. So in each heading there is yes or true, no or false, and then I don't know. So how would I use this? Let's say, for example, you're tackling this question here and it says, which one of the following best reflects the opinion of the two psychologists quoted in the passage? Well, you would go through it one by one. You'll be like, people who feel like imposters should examine their reasoning in order to change self-perception. If you think that was, false, you'd put a 1 here, right? And then we read the next one. People who feel like imposters should find ways to change their behavior. If you feel like that does kind of answer the question, but you're not entirely sure, you can put 2 here. Now, the reason why I'm putting 1 and 2 is because that's the number order of the statements. And then you can go into the next one. There's little that can be done to change the mindset of people who have certain personality traits. Well, for this one, I guess it might be a no. And then looking at the last one, competence is a factor in feeling like an imposter, which means this is harder to change. And let's say, for example, I put that as true. So I put that right there. Oh gosh, that was a lot. So I put that right there. Now, what is the whole point of this, of writing it all down? Number one, let's say you need to control F and move on. When you come back to it, you don't need to reanalyze everything, and you can focus on these 2 columns here. So yes, true, or I don't know. And then you can reanalyze the column that says I don't know and see if that, could possibly be true, or you can spend more time on it and all of that stuff. This table is just for more organizing your thoughts, basically. And whilst tackling it, it might be, you might forget, what was number 1. Did I say that was true or false? But with practice, you might not need to use this table. So after doing this question here, I just draw a line and then I get ready for the next question. This is typically used with, true, false, can't tell questions, or, not necessarily true, false, can't tell questions, but questions which are like this, basically. So they give you a list of different statements. You have to see which one is true and which one's false. That's basically what they're asking you. Okay, moving on to decision making. Now, decision making, I didn't write much on my whiteboard for this. So there wasn't really much I did for decision making apart from writing the word triage. And what questions would I skip or triage? And that was Venn diagrams. But there was a specific style of Venn diagram question which would involve me having to draw out the Venn diagrams, and then it would just take me too long. So I knew to immediately skip that style of question. And then obviously the graph questions as well, which I absolutely hated. So if there was like an overwhelming amount of data thrown at me, then I would be like, nah, nope, move on. But the question then is, what can you do? What can you write on your whiteboard? Well, number 1, you can write a list of topics that, well, I say list, you should aim to keep that list to around 3 or 4, or maybe even 2. But what else can you do? Well, you can do the same thing again, like we looked at verbal reasoning. Calculate how many questions you would need to miss out. I believe there's around either 29 or 30 questions-ish in decision making, and getting around 23 out of the 30 would give you around 800, which is amazing. So obviously I gave myself 5 lives as well for this. So I knew in order to do well in decision making, I can only miss out 5 questions. The reason for that was because in decision making, I was more prone to silly mistakes than the other ones. The reason being for that was syllogisms. I absolutely hated it with a passion. You probably do as well. Oh my gosh. There's a fly. Oh. Anyways, sorry. So, because I was more prone to silly mistakes in decision making, and because I still wanted a decent enough score, I had to compromise and only give myself 5 lives. But even then, for verbal reasoning, 16 questions, missing out on 16 questions can be quite a lot. So your aim is to keep a small amount of lives, so around 8 or 10. But still, I stuck to around 10, I believe, for verbal reasoning. But anyways, moving on. So now we're looking at quantitative reasoning. So what did I put on my whiteboard? Well, I put speed equals distance over time. I put NOB, knob, This triangle formula here was to calculate percentage change. It was very, very useful. I believe I've also released a video on that as well. Then I also talked about, wrote down, sorry, odd, even, elimination. Best thing about quantitative reasoning is that majority of the time, well, I say majority, but quite a few times you can get away with getting the right answer without having to do maths. And that's all to do with elimination techniques, which I've also created a video on, so definitely take a look at that. Then I also wrote down, the fractions and what they're equivalent to. So obviously the more practice you have, the better you become. So I automatically know this is like 0.333, etc. And then this one is 0.4, this, what was the other fraction? 4/5, etc. There are various different fractions that, are quite useful. And the way to know which fractions are useful to write down, that comes with practice. You need to attempt questions and see which fraction would I need to know and how would that save me time. Which fractions would save me time if I knew the decimal version of them, if that makes sense. Not them, version of. Anyways, sorry. So then I also wrote down other equations such as density. There was, I believe that was, no, I had another one which was seconds to minutes to hours. And that would mean divide by 60, divide by 60. So basically my whole whiteboard was just full of formulas that I might forget or things that I might need to be reminded of, for example, of the odd even elimination technique as well. So if I have a series of different answers, I can look at the question and predict whether it will be an odd or an even answer. If it's an even answer, then I can look at the answers, eliminate any other answer that's odd, and sometimes it might be that there's only one even answer, and I know that's my answer without having to do any major maths work, and then I obviously save myself a good 40 seconds. And obviously the less you use your calculator, the better it is. But then sometimes you might be able to use your calculator a lot quicker than, using your head. Sometimes people are a lot quicker with typing than they are with, mental arithmetic. So I didn't really give myself lives for, quantitative reasoning, but I'm still going to put it up on here for you to have a look at the table as well. The reason why I didn't really give myself lives is because I felt like this was one of my strongest subsets. On top of that, if it was my strongest, then I shouldn't really be encouraging myself to miss out any questions. Obviously, triage when necessary, but I wouldn't encourage myself to miss out on that many questions. So moving on to abstract reasoning, the number one thing that I wrote down immediately without having to think twice was, you might know if you've seen my videos before, but my famous mnemonic, so sperm, rose, and arse. Now, if you look at that, it would take me a good minute to write the words for each of those letters, and it took me a bit of practice. I'd literally just practice writing this out. Sometimes you can simplify this as well. I've also put down in my UCAT ebook as well various different variations of the mnemonic and what I wrote down on my whiteboard as well. So take a look at that as well. The link is in the description below. And so I haven't written down what each one stands for, and if you don't know, go into my UCAT playlist and take a look at, I don't know what I've called it, but mnemonics for abstract reasoning, and take a look at that, and hopefully you should be able to find it. In the exam, I still wrote down what each letter stood for, and that took me exactly 1 minute, so it took me the whole entire time. So, but then on top of that, I did once again quickly write 6 lives and then 4 emergency lives. The reason why I did 4 emergency lives is because I knew that missing 6 questions would give me a really nice score. Missing around 4 questions, I felt like wasn't needed, but if absolutely necessary, then I could do that. But then with abstract reasoning, I really didn't like the idea of missing out that many questions, because if you miss out one set, so if you miss out one question, you automatically miss out like another 4 questions, which I absolutely hated. So really, I could only miss out one set of question in order to get a decent score, or even two sets of questions as well. So because obviously the set A, B questions come in like sets of, as in they come in 4 questions, 5 questions at a time. So that wasn't really helpful in terms of missing out certain questions. But once again, experiment. If you have time, experiment with this. Go into Medify, set yourself 10 questions at a time and practice. Okay, see how many questions I can miss out, or do a mock as well, and just see, experiment. Your revision process should involve some sort of experimentation as well. If you're not going to do it now, then you shouldn't be doing it in the exam either. So doing it now, basically you are reassuring yourself and you're comforting yourself in that you've explored various different, techniques and ways of tackling abstract reasoning. So moving on, situational judgment. So once again, very, very simple whiteboard thing that I wrote down here. So I wrote SQB. SQB stands for sensitive, quick, and then boundaries. So sensitive, quick, and boundaries. And basically what each one means is how sensitive you are, or, delicate with the situation. Do you take into consideration the patient's feelings? Whether you are quick as well, so Q for quick. How timely are you with managing the situation? If there's a patient who's having a cardiac arrest, do you go and call the consultant for some help, or do you intervene and do resuscitation? B for boundaries. Boundaries of your role. If I'm a medical student, would I go and break bad news to a patient without the doctor's permission? But even then I wouldn't do it. Not until you're like a fully qualified doctor. So there are various different things to consider, but boundaries of your role really did help me to determine what the answer would be. They always in the question tell you, oh, Joe is a medical student, or Jack is an FY1 student. They're on the wards. That determines the answer, or what is appropriate, or, usually this is used for the appropriateness questions, not necessarily the importantness questions, but once again, it can be applied to both. But that's what I used, and it really did help. And I kind of use that for each one and use that as a checklist. I'll be like, okay, so is it sensitive? Is it quick? Does it follow, does the individual fall into the boundaries of their role? And to really think about the boundaries of your role, kind of put yourself in their shoes. So you are a medical student. Question yourself, I am a medical student. What would I do in this situation? Would I go and break bad news? Think about it. No. So you would do something like that. And I guess that was it. No, it wasn't. So when do I write on my whiteboard? I think I discussed this right at the start. So during 1 minute reading instructions time before each UCAT subset, or before the exam. So you'll find that before the exam there are more instructions to read, and during this time you can write down pretty much everything. So that was pretty much it. That was this whole video. It was around, 20 minutes ish, maybe. Kind of long video, but hopefully you've learned something useful from this. If you have, definitely like this video and definitely share this video, and feel free to message me on Instagram as well, and I will definitely reply to you. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And hopefully you are happy and keep smiling.